That's what's stylish right now in the podcast world. Acting like you don't care is the new caring.
Okay.
Although, I mean, there's still people making them at overproduce.
Yes.
It's really odd.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's ever been a podcast I've listened to, except for maybe if it was like a narrative one, right? Like an audio drama, where I come away from it thinking like, that was the best theme song I've ever heard. And that is why I need to come back and listen to it again.
You'd be surprised when because I built a lot of, I helped a lot of people start shows back when I was working for myself, and the amount of time people would agonize over the music and the name, and I'm like, trust me, in 3 episodes, people are not going to care. As long as it's the same music or the same name, you're fine.
It's fine.
But they're like, what is this communicating?
Oh, man.
I don't know.
Did any of that come into consideration when you started yours?
The music part?
Or just any of the intro? Like, did you want to have any of that?
I mean, the music comes from the guy who downloads it and converts it into whatever.
Okay, yeah. Your third party guy.
And so he supplies the music. I don't listen to it once he puts it on. But I mean, I listen to a lot of. My wife and I both listen to a lot of podcasts, and they're just really informal. I mean, there have been some good ones that are produced well, but I was just listening to Westminster Seminary Machen podcast that they put out, and it's just overdone.
Yeah,
music, and they have like the host is kind of narrating at different points, and then goes back to the questioning the guest, and just let it go.
Well, so you're saying that they literally have the host who does monologues to the side during the interview segment?
Not to the side, but I guess. I'm not sure if the guest is listening while he makes those kinds of commentary interludes.
It sounds like it might be coming in externally, like just edited in as opposed to organically.
It could be, but
I mean, if it's a question, then that already you've lost, right? It's not clearly communicated.
Yeah, I don't know. A lot of people listen to podcasts mostly because they're trying to feel like they're a part of a conversation. It's parasocial, right? They're there. They're like, I just want to be with my friends, or people who I think know a lot about a certain topic. And so, the more informal, usually the better. Depends on what you're trying to do, though. But all the most popular shows in America, super informal, super duper duper informal.
Yeah, which is when it's weird when you listen or find something that's highly produced because it feels like a whiplash, back and forth.
Yeah,
strange. Now. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. But
just before go for it. About how you feel like you're part of it. So, I mean, there's actually a guy I listen to who does like a 2-hour segments a week. He's a journalist of some kind. He's in California. I'm trying to meet with him when my wife and I are going to be out in California house sitting, and he's really reluctant to get together. Everybody else I've contacted has generally been willing if I'm buying them a drink or something.
Yeah.
And I can understand why he's suspicious, and it kind of adds to the mystery of the guy. But it's also really frustrating.
Yeah.
And it also makes it seem like if I do eventually succeed, I'm not giving up. There's one more strategy I'm going to use. That is
which is blackmail.
No, but it's just going to it'll be a bad experience because expectations on either side will be, but there's an intimacy about this kind of format that is very different from radio, television, even when they break the fourth wall, seemingly.
Yeah.
No, this is like you're into a world of the people who are talking in a way that you're not with which I think is really something that's odd. I actually would like to write about it.
It's exceptional for sure.
I always tell people when you're doing a podcast, because radio, it's timing based. At the very least, if you're listening to live radio, it has to be at certain times.
Right.
And there's a certain power to that because there's consistency. But I always tell people when you're in someone's ear, you're in their ear when they're doing the dishes, when they're dropping their kids off at school, when they're doing yard work, all these things, and you insert yourself into their domestic life. So not only are you a part of their entertainment, but you're a part of their everyday experiences. You're a part of the laundry. You are a part of cooking dinner. The hearth. You're there with them, and because of that, there's this one-sided thing that grows like that. I'm sure that the reason why that person is so hesitant to meet with you is because he's met with fans, and it's a strange phenomenon because they know all these things about you, and they're implicitly interested in you, and because you've been in their ear for so long, they sort of have this expectation that you're going to be interested in them. You know what I mean? And I don't know, it creates a strange power dynamic between the two.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I always think about is like there are, let's say, every episode, arbitrarily, there are 10 jokes that I say, right? One of those jokes in the 7th episode could have been somebody's favorite bit that they've ever heard, me ever do. And they could walk up to me and say it directly to my face, and I would have no idea what they were talking about, right? Like that is all in one ear, out the other, and it could have had that tangible effect, but it's the relationship is not two-sided in that instance, right?
Right.
Like, especially because unlike live performance, there was no feedback happening while we're doing this, right? Like, this could be the funniest thing anybody's ever heard or the most interesting thing anybody's ever heard, but we wouldn't hear it from them directly right this second. And so I don't have that kind of, feedback to go with. So it's strange. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure that you've actually sort of experienced that because when you're doing a freewheeling intellectual discussion, like something you would have on your podcast, where you're going through something, and you make a point, and in that moment you make a point because you think it's important, but that could just be the thing that stuck with somebody.
Right. I mean, what you said, though, about the way it enters into your everyday life, I listen to podcasts as I walk back and forth to campus, and I can remember if I happen to re-listen to something with my wife, say, I can remember where I was on the street when I heard or something. It's very weird the way memory also remembers.
There's a particular podcast of the Martyr Made stuff where I have periods of my life that are colored by what I was listening to while I was at home
which
working.
Music has that same power.
Yeah, it does. I think it's very similar in that regard. So, sometimes I go back and re-listen to, episodes from that show, and I'll be just immediately like, I remember where I was. I remember where I was in my life at the time. It kind of just pulls you right back, which I think a lot of media can do that too. Yeah. But I think a part of it is I'm actively doing something else, which makes a weird deja vu to it in a strange way.
Well, especially since with podcasts and MP3s and whatever, when you can carry it around with you, you can't carry a TV. I guess some people do watch stuff on their phones, but
much to Martin Scorsese and Denis Villeneuve's chagrin.
Yes, exactly.
And radio, I mean, used to be sort of confined, obviously transistors, whatever, you could carry them around, but the ubiquity of these devices is really extraordinary. And I don't use 4G, 5G. I guess we don't even have 5G yet.
No, not here.
But I don't use 4G much. But that's a very different kind of. I mean, I don't know if you guys probably didn't grow up with cars with the AM dial, and you'd actually, it was an analog dial, and you're driving at night, and you can get stations here from the East Coast, but they fade out, and some nights are better than others depending on the atmosphere, and it's just but it's dependent on in some ways where your device is, and now it's much less so, even though, as you're both saying, it's your memory of it is tied very much to where you were physically, but also that time in your life.
Yeah. I mean, it can be consumed anywhere, right? Like geographically, you were not tied, right? In a lot of respects, I think, East Coast, West Coast divide in 90s rap, right? Comes down to the fact that geographically, that kind of music needed to be disseminated through radio stations and didn't always make it to the other side, right? So there's a tribalism there. There's popular music from one side of the country in comparison to the other, right? You don't get that at all anymore. I mean, outside of very niche local artists, right?
Yeah, well, there's the atomizing element, though, that creates because you have full control over your entertainment at all times, right? You don't have to... there's a certain democratizing thing that happens because you're not beholden to a tastemakers, right? payola can't decide, what you're listening to. But at the same time, it means that your tastes are yours and you can listen to whatever you want at any given moment. And it means that you can sort of isolate yourself from any sort of
external
local community,
Yeah.
And just exist perfectly happy in your own media sphere, which is damaging, I think, because there's a lot of discovery, a lot of commonality. I was watching a video the other day about why NASCAR was at one point the second most popular sport in America. And it came down to the Daytona 500. It was the first I think it wasn't the first running of it may have been the first running of the Daytona 500. Might have been the first running of the Daytona 500. Right, I'm no expert in NASCAR, but CBS picks up the broadcast. It's the first nationally broadcast NASCAR race. And the entire eastern seaboard gets hit by a record blizzard, right? Everybody's inside. There's only 3 channels. There's nothing else to do. You watch NASCAR. And it happens to be one of the most exciting photo finishes in NASCAR history. All of a sudden, it's the second most popular sport in America. And there's this universal, everybody watched it. The numbers are insane. It's like 20, 30 million people watch this. And nowadays, 20, 30 million people don't watch any live TV, except for maybe the Super Bowl.
Yeah, except for maybe that. Yeah. Or the Dota Grand World Finals and esports. Those are the two things that maybe you could say are universal live events that people watch, which is just crazy. No, any dang way. We might as well, right? At this point, we're well into conversation. So, everybody, welcome to the Monomaniacs podcast, a show where we talk about the things that we are interested in, the things that are interesting to us at the moment. And today we've got our guest on the show, Dr. Darryl Hart. Welcome. Host of the Paleo Protestant podcast. Yes, I want to ask you about that in a second. And historian. Welcome. Now, podcast. Okay. I remember you mentioning once that it has something to do with the way that British people say podcast as opposed to podcast. Could you go into more detail on that?
I'm a big fan of the In Our Time show, which I've given up on public radio now for a while, but I don't know that we could produce anything like it. But anyway, so they have academics, so it's an academic sort of thing, but it's actually very accessible. And I can't remember, Martin somebody is the host, who's written a lot of historical novels, and they'll talk about the Crusades or the investor a lot of Western civvy things, but the whatever voice it is that BBC hires to introduce their shows, she always says podcast. It's just it's the way the proper British people pronounce it.
Okay,
podcast, and I think it's kind of charming.
Yeah. So I forget whether or not. Is it written out like I think it's digitally as podcast?
It
like
is,
sweet.
You got to make your mark any way that you can.
Well, no, I don't even think it's that. I think it's just a lot of additional self-confidence. You're like, screw it, we're gonna do it, man.
Well, I'm also a bit of an Anglophile.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So where does that come from then?
The Anglophilia?
Yeah, the Anglophilia. Because right now, I don't know if you're aware of this, there's a young Anglophobia that is brewing. Young people are very Anglophobic now. It's cool to be Anglophobic. So I'm curious sort of where your Anglophilia comes from.
I think I have it could go back to BBC production of Evelyn Waugh's novel The Wise and the title escaping me, with Jeremy Irons. Brideshead Revisited.
Yes,
which is a great show. It's old people television, but still, but it's got a huge dollop from The Crown, which I didn't like Downton Abbey. That was too
melodramatic.
Yeah, soap opera-y, and I think some people think that The Crown is just it's like Downton Abbey, but with the Queen. And I don't think it is, but I think there are ways of... Peter Morgan, the creator and main writer of the show, is curious that he wrote every single episode of season 4 about the breakup of Charles and Diana's marriage. But he's actually I think, a pretty deep student of the monarchy and what it represents in the history of Britain, British history, the decline of the empire, and all that. And I mean, people might think this is silly, but there's an element of Shakespeare to it. Shakespeare wrote, I don't know, remember how many plays about the British, the English monarchy.
Yeah.
And, you know, and Shakespeare took lots of liberties and whatnot. So that was another big part of it.
Yeah. And, you know, you can't read Shakespeare without there being a really heavy political angle to it all, you know, about the rights and responsibilities of king and
great chain of being and such. Yes. So you would say that you are recently more Anglophilic than you have been in the past. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think you're correct on all counts in regards to Downton Abbey in comparison to The Crown. You know, my wife watched through all of Downton Abbey and has also watched through all of The Crown. And I am far more apt to watch The Crown with her than I would any episode of Downton Abbey. And I think it just comes down to, it feels like prestige television, right? It feels like I'm watching something that's in conversation with The Wire or The Sopranos or True Detective. A lot less when it comes to Downton Abbey. That feels more like a General Hospital is in conversation with them.
Yeah.
But since you guys both went to Hillsdale, I mean, I also think Western heritage really sets up a kind of Anglophilia, since the course ends with 17th century England and Scotland with the Stuarts. But so and since I've been teaching here, I've been thinking a lot more about the Anglo-American political tradition.
Yeah.
Which I do think is fairly exceptional among Western political traditions. And I still don't think I understand the origins of that, but that's another reason. I mean, I do look at the United States as a kind of cousin of the British history, and obviously there's been a lot of differences since the middle of the 19th century, for instance. But
no, I mean, I think that a lot of, at least the way that we were taught Western heritage, right? Like, you know, the great Western tradition, I would say a solid almost third of it is dominated by, you know, the British Empire, you know, in all regards, you know, and even up until the modern era, you know, literature in the English language was still viewed as the best came from Britain, right? Only very recently has that shifted. And so, you know, when it comes to cultural impact and what is viewed as culturally important, a lot of that is British, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the phobia that exists now.
Right, I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think
so. These are people who are thinking about, especially guys, thinking about Rome, or what?
No. It's more. It's less about. It's actually, I think, on the opposite side of the spectrum. There, it isn't sort of this, you know, empire comparison thing. It's more, Britain has officially sunsetted itself, you know, and watching it in its death throes, you know, kind of unvital, unable to do anything really, terrible economy, kind of a broken, fragmented culture. It's just kind of, it's depressing. It's a depressing country. And so
it is, unfortunately.
And because of that, I think that's where a lot of it, it's like kind of a kicking it while they're down sort of situation. And I think also people sort of turned on Britain in the wider culture because
of Brexit, particularly.
Well, not because of Brexit particularly, but there's a desire to kind of, because as anti-colonialism and specifically anti-colonialism becomes a lot more popular as a progressive political issue, you know, who's an easier target? The British Empire, the colonizer.
Yeah.
So I think that's a part of it as well.
Huh. I mean, and how widespread would you say it, or where does it?
Where does it manifest itself?
In formal conversations? Or?
I think in formal conversations, a lot of it's on Twitter. A lot of it I witness sort of hanging out with 20-somethings in DC. I think it's just they're easy to make fun of.
Yeah.
You know, and there's this thing that it's a phenomenon that a lot of people have talked about called safe racism. Where it's a weird thing where,
all right, everybody buckle up.
Well, no, it's pretty easy. It's a pretty easy explanation. It's where people specifically kind of on the left, go out of their way to be performatively racist against Italians, French people, and British people.
Yeah.
You know, like the classic one is like saying British people. You know what I mean? Stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think it's just sort of kind of a safe, edgy thing to do is to make fun of those groups. So
anti-French content is very prevalent on the internet.
yeah, people are also very anti-French.
People make fun of the French all of the time, which I think like we were almost.
And it's not like from like a making fun of the stereotypes of a country sort of thing. It's more like, no, these are bad people, you know, but it's sort of dressed up in a comedic way, you know, and you'd expect that sort of from like a reactionary young conservative groups. But no, it's usually kind of people who are kind of identify as leftists.
So is there a European or non-American society power that these people tend to, I mean, Ukraine?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even really think there is. I think that it's not so much, I think it's the antithesis of somebody being a power. You know what I mean? It's more like, oh yeah, so it's not about the countries. It's not about Britain or France or Italy or Germany. It's about the occupied peoples over which that they have dominion, like the Roma or etc. So, but yeah, no, it's strange. I mean, it's not as controversial as this phrase like safe racism would indicate,
imply,
but Britain sort of has been wrapped up
in that
as well. And there's sort of people also are really starting to be performatively opposed to the British accent. That's another thing.
Wow.
The British accent?
Yes, they like to say they hate the British accent.
Okay. One thing about the British accent that's interesting is most European and Asian countries, or even African countries that learn English, all have British accents when you talk to them,
right? Because
that's how the English language is communicated and taught in those regions. Less so in America than American accents.
Have you? I'm sure you've met somebody like this before. Have you ever met somebody who has given themselves a British accent?
Yes.
Yeah,
but I don't remember who. And it was kind of mild, but it was still a little weird.
I remember meeting a guy once who had never been to Britain, had never met a British person, but just sort of woke up one day and decided this was going to be his thing. So he just did it.
As you said earlier, you got to differentiate yourself somehow.
Yes. Well, actually, I think there was somebody, a guy that we used to know in college. There was a student who had a speech impediment and whose speech therapist gave him a British accent.
But wouldn't it be kind of cool to speak English with a French accent?
Yes.
Or an Italian accent and adopt that.
Safe racism.
Or a Russian accent.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. That would be hilarious if that was like literally every single day, right? You were so committed to the bit that people thought you were like a French national.
But is it possible that different parts of Russia have different, if they learn English, have a different kind of accent? Or is there one?
Yeah, or all the Cyrillic languages, are they all turning into just one? Because, if I were to talk to a guy who was Chechen or whatever, there's no way I'd be able to tell a difference based off of their English accent. But I imagine they're virtually incomprehensible when they speak Russian to each other, So I don't know. I imagine that there is slight differences.
Yeah.
But you have to be...
I think it's really hard for an external ear to... I think you hit the nail on the head. There's a classic story of somebody who was learning Japanese in college and would come into class, performed very well in class, but the teacher took him aside and said, "Hey, you have to stop watching gangster films because you sound like a Yakuza when you talk to me. You sound like a Yakuza." Which, again, like you would have no understanding of that differentiation, except for maybe an inflection. But I find that fascinating. Very funny.
Aren't there like people who are such talented linguists to where that they can discern what neighborhood somebody in London is from, or et cetera? So maybe there's an equivalent there.
Yeah, I believe that's like the first 40 minutes of My Fair Lady is just somebody flexing about that. So I assume it's true. I assume it happens. Goodness. Well, you're on the podcast you're the guest here.
Sure.
What kind of topic do you want to discuss? Is there anything that you're particularly thinking about or interested in? I know we kind of touched a little bit on what you had mentioned beforehand earlier on, but do you want to go in more depth on that?
Well, I was thinking about devices, streaming services, pop culture, the idea that people were watching 20 or 30 million were watching a NASCAR event. And I mean, some of this gets into the recent death of Matthew Perry. And, it's striking that the 90s was an amazing period for comedy. And I mean, so I guess when my wife and I didn't watch Friends, we actually didn't have cable, so we weren't watching much TV. We've streamed now a lot of that stuff, but Friends, Seinfeld, Mad About You, and Frasier, I think were all on at the same time. And then about just before that, the Larry Sanders Show had been on HBO, and that's a cable channel, so it wasn't network. But do you need broadcast television for sitcoms to actually make? Because I don't know, what are the sitcoms now that people?
Yeah, well, there's
most people like to talk about the sitcoms that came before.
Yes,
right?
there are most streaming services now have like a flagship sitcom that they are putting on. So like, I think there's a revival of How I Met Your Mother. Frasier's back again.
Yes,
right.
They brought Frasier back.
Looks really bad.
It does.
Frasier's back again. I think that's Paramount that has them, or is it Peacock? I don't know. So like most of them have it, but you're watching it and it's definitely, you get the impression that the sitcom is not meant for the. I was going to say the small screen. Definitely meant for the small screen. Is not meant for
the streaming service.
The streaming service. Yeah, there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, one of the things that I think we've lost with streaming, and people have talked about this all the time, but the idea that you're able to consume all the content simultaneously, right, and are not limited by waiting a week for this kind of a thing, kind of hurts it in the sense that not only do you consume it like that and then you're done, you kind of discard it, but it doesn't become a part of your routine, right? Like you're not like, okay, so Friday nights I watch Seinfeld, and that's a fun thing that me and my friends do. So, our parents would, get together to watch Seinfeld with people, right? That was a thing that you would do. Friends is a great example of this because of the fact that speaking of parasocial, right? It felt like you were getting together and watching your friends hang out, right? The idealistic version of what Friends could be. And so, having it all available at once, right? If you were to watch How I Met Your Mother now or Friends now, all at the same time. And I did that over a summer, right? The summer between senior year and the freshman year of college, watched all of Friends. I could literally maybe remember 20% of it, right? And if that, and I don't even know if I have any personal connection to it really. I came out of it being like, that was okay, and then just, disconnected. So yeah, it's a lot harder, I think, to stick, right? There's not like a generation defining sitcoms. Are not common, or even generation defining comedic television, right? Like maybe like Schitt's Creek has been a big deal, but I wouldn't say that's generation defining.
I mean, I've never seen it, and I've known people who haven't seen it. You know what I mean? It's not like, I remember when The Office was first on TV.
Oh yeah,
and there wasn't a human being you could talk to who hadn't seen that show. So I don't know, definitely a separation there, but
my generation talks about where they were when MASH, the last episode of MASH.
Yes,
classic.
But there was, in the 70s, there was MASH, there was Archie Bunker, there was Mary Tyler Moore Show, there was Bob Newhart. And even into the 80s, there was a lineup on Thursday nights with Cheers and Cosby, and there was one more.
I'm trying to think in that class.
There were like 2 hours, but the third one kept changing, and one of the really funny ones that didn't last was Buffalo Bill. I can't remember the actor's name, but it was a really great show, but a little too edgy, and I think they dropped it.
Yeah. So actually, speaking specifically about Cheers, I was watching a video about Cheers the other day, and they were talking about how, in a way that isn't the case for a lot of the sitcoms that, like the 90s sitcoms, they were really concerned with character You know, there was everybody in the show kind of has a real arc. They make sense. They're kind of moving through a story. They're adaptive to the audience, but also, you know, they're growing as people in a real tangible way. Were you much of a Cheers fan?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
And I think part of the appeal of for my wife and I of Frasier has been the extension of that character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what's also amazing about, I mean, this Cheers had it too. They had this, since it was set in Boston, they were playing up the academic reputation, you know, university town. So
Yeah.
Diana was this kind of weird, intellectual, aspiring woman, and you know, obviously she had a relationship with Frasier.
Yeah.
So then he takes that same sort of thing in a psychological form out to Seattle, and then you have him and his brother. They have all these very high end tastes, and they know
Yeah.
all the wine, the cheeses, whatnot. They got these, and I'm thinking, wait, isn't this like the period in Seattle of when grunge is happening?
Yeah.
Too, and I just don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't object to it at all. It seems authentic, but
That's
since you guys come from the area,
so that's the funny thing about it is
Yeah.
that when you talk to somebody nobody in Seattle ever talked about Frasier ever.
No, yeah.
It was not a cultural thing.
Not a popular sitcom.
Really?
I mean, it was a popular sitcom as any other sitcom,
Yeah,
but it
but
wasn't
like-
sort of, nobody was walking around walking around Seattle being like, and this is the Frasier place where Frasier's
right.
set.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it, is that it was totally disconnected in its content. You know, and the nice thing about Frasier is that it has like kind of a highfalutin air to it, but at the end of the day, it's, you know, he's a hooligan like anybody else, which is what makes it fun, but it still does sort of have this air of separation. And I don't know, if you talk to people, like, Seattle is not the city Frasier kind of makes it out to be, I think. And maybe it was for a brief period, kind of maybe in the early 90s, but, you know, there is an opera house, but it's not like this is something that people are doing all the time.
Right.
You know, it's not like, it's a tech city. It's young money. It's flashy. You know, there's a huge wealth disparity. You know, it's not the kind of place like Boston, or they made it seem more New England than they did
Right.
West Coast.
And there's,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how far we are into it, or at least into the third season, but there doesn't seem to be any awareness of the tech, you know, the
Yeah.
Microsoft world,
Mhm.
let alone the big military industrial complex.
Yeah, Boeing,
Facilities,
etc.
right.
Yeah, like they don't. It definitely feels separate. I mean, it's a great show, but I don't think it very accurately depicts the Emerald City.
Yeah, I mean, I am always consistently surprised when people say that they really like Frasier, because I never heard a person say that when I was
Really?
in Washington State. Yeah, like
Yeah.
I've never heard somebody even bring it up in conversation, right? It's when I met people outside of Seattle that would be like, "Oh yes, that is where Sleepless in the Seattle and Frasier take place."
Yeah.
Great city.
Yeah.
something scrambled eggs.
Yeah.
Oh goodness.
Yeah, you can take a Sleepless in Seattle tour. I don't know if you can take a Frasier tour. You probably can.
I bet you can.
You probably can.
I mean,
I don't know if there's much to see.
Yeah, I mean they squeeze every little bit of money they can out of that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no, I think interestingly you mentioned The Office. I would say probably like The Office and How I Met Your Mother were probably the last big sitcoms for young people, right? Or for at least our generation.
Yeah.
Nobody younger than us is watching sitcoms. I can tell you that much.
Yeah, well, if they are, they're watching Friends, or
Yeah.
they're watching The Office.
Yeah.
Like The Office, part of its staying power was that it was like the first major sitcom to be on streaming that everybody could watch as much as they want.
You know, and some people, I'm not going to say who in this room, may have seen it well over 9 times. Yeah, 9 times. So, I mean, example A.
This is where my Anglophilia kicks in. I mean,
Yeah.
I like it when I see it. If I'm in a hotel room late at night, I'll put it on when it's in syndication or something.
Yeah.
But I aspire to be a snob. I'm really not, but I aspire to be it. So that means the original, the BBC version of The
Exactly.
Office
Yeah.
is like the standard. And what I like about that is that it's self-contained.
Yeah.
I mean, they did they did 12 episodes, and they did the 2 specials, maybe even one more after that. But they had a nice storyline, a nice arc. They let it finish, and Americans just beat the thing. They just keep
as long as possible.
But I mean, that applies to all American television.
Yeah.
It's not just this one.
Yeah.
But and I was intrigued to see, okay, you're going to take this now beyond 12 episodes, because at least the first 4 or 5 were pretty much a repeat of the original. Yeah. Okay, good. I'd like to see how these characters develop, but then it just...
Yeah, it kind of takes a life of its own.
Right.
And I feel like the closest thing we have to having shows that have real concrete lengths in America is like HBO shows where every season changes something, like The Wire, where it's like we're focusing on a different part of Baltimore, or True Detective, where it's just a total recreation.
Or Fargo.
Or Fargo is a good example, right? Because, even dramas, everything. It's like we have to push it as long as possible.
It's funny how for every famous American TV show, right? This goes from The Simpsons to The Office, mostly comedic stuff. The thing you always hear is first season, not the best. Seasons 2 through 7, ideal. After that, it just all sucks, right? And that's like a consistent thing, right? Like there is a life cycle here, but they're not willing to stop it when the life cycle turns bad, right? Yeah. I was trying to think. There's speaking of television that people like, but I know the Boys, right? Everybody's talking about The Boys is a pretty common thing. That is a show was originally planned for 5 seasons. They have thrown all those plans out and are going for as long as they can, right?
Where is it? Where do you find it?
That's on Hulu,
okay.
I believe. Yeah.
Amazon.
Oh, sorry. My apologies.
It's their flagship product.
Yes.
Is it a comedy?
No. It's like
it's
a dramedy.
It's in the vein of Watchmen, where it's like a superheroes, but they're bad, like they're evil. Is the take.
I'm actually curious what you have to say, because we're on the edge of it. We hit peak superhero, and we're on the precipitous fall of that genre. I'm curious what your opinion is on there sort of being a monoculture for a while in the blockbuster, or even in television, where everything was superhero related.
I don't know. I'm not aware of it. In fact,
oh, really? Great. Lucky you.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, Ann and I, we were with some. Sorry, is it okay to mention my wife?
Yeah, you're fine.
You can edit that out. Right? We were with some younger people from the college, graduates, and the younger people got talking about these franchise, Harry Potter, these franchise books, movies. And we were thinking later that the only franchise I can remember from our generation were the Bond movies, James Bond movies. But, and I guess there were maybe super action of some kind, or superhero, sorry. But I mean, I didn't watch them. That's not what I like to watch. So maybe they were there and I wasn't aware of them. But but the franchise phenomenon does seem to me much more of a 80s, maybe even 90s and later phenomenon than 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah, when you started to kind of when people started to make jokes about franchising becoming too ridiculous was sometime in the early 90s.
Was it?
Or like late 80s. Like I think there's a joke in Back to the Future 2 where they go and they see like a placard for Jaws 7, because at that point there'd been like 3 Jaws movies, which at the time was insane that they'd make 3 of one type of movie. But yeah, it's weird because I'm struggling to think of any sort of franchise either from the late century.
Well, and not only that, but the Bond films weren't like, they didn't follow a canon. Right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe a canon, but they didn't have a narrative throughout, right? They didn't have like this first Bond film is setting up things that are going to come to pass in Bond film number 7.
Yeah.
Or at least that was never the anticipation. It was always, we are making a Bond film. It is a self-contained story. and we're going to unify this. It's going to have its own brand, its own kind of director. It's going to, there's a wide variety of styles, and it's not connected except for, like you would say the novels are, right? With the similar characters. There's a unified villain periodically, but that's about as far as it goes, right?
So does that mean that Star Wars is like the first franchise?
I mean, well,
it's interesting.
It was just a trilogy, though,
right?
And I guess that does make it a franchise, but I guess
it was also written as a trilogy initially.
Yeah, it was the first. I say it was probably the first blockbuster franchise.
Yeah,
like Lucas and Spielberg, I think, were kind of the foundation by which they're being like, okay, this is massive money. We're gonna have cartoons. We're having action figures.
Mm-hmm.
We're building an entire media empire based off of this. TV shows, Christmas specials, like there's stuff. I guess you might be able to say though that maybe like the Peanuts,
right?
Yeah, but that's also narratively disconnected. It's more of like a cultural phenomenon, like Garfield, right? Like I wouldn't call Garfield. I mean, I guess technically a franchise, but I wouldn't call him.
Were there Peanuts movies?
There was the specials.
The
television specials.
As far as it goes.
Yeah. But no, I mean, there was a Peanuts movie like 4 years ago.
I think it was. Yeah,
it was really poorly received.
Plus, what child under the age of 15 knows what the Peanuts are anymore?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Unless they watched
for a whole new generation.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, we're even too young, I think, to conceivably have been into the Peanuts. But
at the other end of this, though. I'm curious what your generation makes of late night talk shows.
Yeah. So
big
as
deal,
a genre, and I mean, Johnny Carson for me growing up was, the guy. Yeah. There was one show they tried to run competitors at him, and I don't know if you guys know this, remember this. They actually tried Pat Sajak as a late.
Yes.
No, I didn't know about this.
I heard of this. Yeah.
But Johnny was like iconic, and I even remember as a 7-8-year-old thinking, I'm watching this, and I don't get the jokes, but it's like an adult world in a not a bad way.
Yeah.
That I want to know more about, and who these stars are and what's going on, and there's jokes I'm not getting and the references, but there was a kind of elegance to it, somewhat.
Yeah.
And I don't keep up with Kimmel and the other guys now. I'm not up that late, and I wouldn't stream it.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of show to stream either. I don't.
No. Yeah. It's.
But I mean, I wonder what your generation.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
The way that our generation has experienced. I mean, and we're kind of on the cusp of this, but definitely for people younger than us.
Yeah.
Late night TV is a content mill for the secondary content market. So YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook.
Yeah.
And not a majority of the money that they make, because they get a lot of eyes still, I think, sort of. I mean, but there's like 5 shows.
I know. I mean, Fallon probably gets the most.
I think he might be.
Corbin definitely doesn't.
Well, he's done. They canceled that.
They canceled that. Good.
But
get him out of there.
Mostly, they have segments in which they have the interviews, or they have special things that they make the celebrities do that are kind of embarrassing, or et cetera.
Yeah.
And then those go up on YouTube.
Okay.
And then those are prioritized by the YouTube algorithm because it's safe, because it's for broadcast television, and they get hundreds of millions of views.
Yeah.
So majority of people
who
who
look at the trending page on YouTube, it's not as much as it used to be, but for the 2012 to 2018, it was almost exclusively clips from Kimmel and Fallon, right? It was like Daniel Radcliffe raps, right? And then that would be really far up there, and then that receives more eyes on it than ever watched it live,
ever.
Right? And what ends up happening is it's much more compartmentalized, cut down content, where it's like, all right, we've got this 5-minute segment, right? We're gonna nail this. We're gonna make it short form. It's all gonna try to weave it together. But what really is important is that each one of these 5-minute segments are, we can upload that on YouTube and get, good revenue from it.
Yeah.
See, I think this means that Larry Sanders, I think, is still my favorite comedy, and it was on HBO 92 to 98. I didn't see it then, and I think it was their first hit. And it is it's a show about a late night talk show. So it's going behind the scenes. You see how the sausage is made, as it were. And what's really remarkable about it, among many things, is that it's a study of celebrity and the kind of egos that these people have, but in a nice way. It's not vicious. And I've seen Gary Shandling interviewed, who's now deceased, but he said one of the decisions they made was to invite people to come on, like an Alec Baldwin or somebody who's going to be a guest on the show within the show.
Yeah.
And they're going to let him figure out whether he wants to be Alec Baldwin or make up a
version of Alec Baldwin.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's that kind of meta going on, if that's the right use of meta.
Yeah.
But then it's also reverential to the talk show, Tonight Show with Carson, because guys like Shandling, to make it as a comic, you had to get on and you had to kill.
Yeah.
And if he invited you back to the chair,
you made it.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was that whole dynamic in the comedy world. And so Shandling is very much, kind of playing off that. It's just a wonderful show. And there are times when I actually weep because it's kind of poignant and nostalgic in really in good ways. But if you didn't grow up with Tonight Show, I don't know if it's going to hit you. Or if you grew up with even Fallon and Kimmel, watching them in their entirety.
No, yeah. I mean, I think the most popular amongst the media literate, right, of our generation was the Stephen Colbert Show, which was a parody of a talk show, right?
Yeah.
A parody of a conservative talk show.
But for the real heads, it was Conan O'Brien.
Yes, sure. The real heads out there, they love the Conan. But yeah, I mean, it's so strange how there was a period of time where all of America would tune in every night for that one particular thing, right? There's a reason why things are so segmented for late night, because everybody's got their guy, everybody's got their competitor. There's even like the Drew Barrymore show recently canceled for using scab labor.
Yeah. Was that late night though?
It's in the same vein. I mean, it's like it's not Martha Stewart. Who's that country singer guy?
It's not the Carrie Underwood show. It's the something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, it's that same kind of brand. It's like, putting in celebrity in a talk show setting, with audience interaction, like the Ellen Show.
Yeah.
Right? That's more daytime, but in that same vibe. Everybody's bounced off of it, right? Nobody wants to consume that anymore. I don't know if it's because they view it as ungenuine, whether or not they don't, they prefer it to be more written and less organic. I don't know.
I have a good question for you, Dr. Hart, about something you mentioned earlier with there being that separation, that atomizing, or like, different people watch, they're not being the one show. I often think about democratized media. How nowadays it seems like everybody kind of, because it's so specialized, everybody kind of gets a say, where before, and some people would call this gatekeeping, I guess is a derogatory way to describe this, but the networks, the studio, the record label, they were the people who were sort of deciding what it was that you listened to or watched or just consumed, period. A lot of people our age are sort of weirdly nostalgic for a world in which that was the case. Do you think that there's merit to that there's a certain value to people who know what they're doing being the ones kind of having control over that sort of media, as far as quality is concerned?
Oh, boy. I mean, there's so much bad stuff that was also made in that system. I mean, if I don't know if you guys grew up with the made-for-TV movies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've maybe watched 1.5 of those. I mean, they're just so bad. But there were people who actually there were gatekeepers thinking this is going to be a good thing, and there were celebrities who had careers in some ways based on that. So I mean, I guess my impression is there's a nostalgia for something more common and shared, and maybe even a sense I wish more people appreciated this, not because my tastes are necessarily better, although they may think that, but also because it'd be more fun to have more people talk about it and have that kind of be a marker of their experience in a way. But I don't know. I'm actually teaching a 1-hour course on Hollywood.
Yeah.
In the spring, and I want to try to at least especially have students exposed to the golden era of Hollywood, which is roughly 35 to 50 or 55. And I'm not necessarily a fan of that as the era. I actually think 70s Hollywood, when you saw people breaking out of some of the genres or playing with the genres,
the new school directors,
right, and even the kind of anti-hero type figures, like the way Pacino came up that way, and Gene Hackman and others. I think in some ways that was a better era, and I think the Hollywood system was breaking down then. But there were still constraints. I mean, studios still controlled a lot, distribution especially, and same thing with TV. But now with social media, it's so darn hard to control.
Yeah. I think part of the reason why people, it's not just a commonality. I think that people are starting to realize, or at least I'm under this impression, that democratized media is sort of intrinsically, it's kind of bad. You know, the most popular, you know, you can be a patrician about it and say, by virtue of it being popular means it's bad. Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. But it seems like a lot of bad stuff is ballast by the fact that it's about getting eyeballs. You know what I mean? And being in front of as many people as possible in a fragmented world. And so sometimes lower quality things become the most popular.
So what would be an example? I mean, not a particular show necessarily, but even stuff on YouTube or
like
X, or I mean,
stuff on YouTube or a lot of
like, are you thinking
as well.
of like a Mr. Beast kind of figure, or
no, not stuff like that. Not like, I don't know, stuff like a Has-Been Hotel thing.
Yeah,
you know
I mean, well, so here's my counter argument to that, though.
Yeah.
Is I think you'd be really hard pressed to say that we're still not getting good content.
I don't think
it's just the percentage is a lot higher of bad content because the barrier to entry is lower, right?
Low. Yeah.
So obviously you're getting inundated with a lot more bad content on the average, I would say. But I think it's still conducive to creating good content, and I would say overall the good content tends to rise to the top. You know, the goal is always to get the most eyeballs on a thing, right? I mean, that's what a network director was thinking, where it's like, what is the thing that's going to get people to watch my network, right? So I'm hard pressed to believe that is an inherently bad thing.
A fun fact about those TV movies they were talking about: people still make those, but it's for those streaming services that nobody ever uses. You know, they'll have like a budget of $30,000 or something, and they'll knock it out in 2 weeks, and they'll sell it to Tubi or Pluto TV for $35,000. And so there's thousands of them, and thousands of them, more than ever. You know, a really common thing is there's a lot of horror ones.
Really?
Yeah, they'll use nouns and stuff that remind you of other more popular movies. And there's
what's the length
thousands
of
them
them roughly?
Just enough to be a feature film.
Yeah.
So 70 minutes, roughly. About 70 minutes, or I guess always. Is 70 minutes the threshold, or is it 90 minutes?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Feature film threshold, but it's easy to get to 90 minutes when you have a lot of shots of cars driving.
Mm-hmm. True. True. That's different.
Helicopter shots. Now with drones. Everything's got a helicopter shot in it now because drones are so cheap.
Yes. It's not a marker of quality anymore. Are you seeing mixed results on that?
Yeah, so
we can't hear you.
Screen Actors Guild, just repeat what I'm saying.
Screen Actors Guild says
Minimum length is 80 minutes.
minimum 80 minutes.
80 minutes.
Right
okay.
down the center there.
Right down the center.
The Academy says 40 minutes. So
40 minutes?
That's what the Academy says.
I thought there was a certain length you had to play in order to be in a theater. And that's how you delineate whether or not the Academy are you're able to even apply for an Academy Award or be qualify for an Academy Award, whether or not you play in a theater, which is why streaming service movies like The Irishman played in some theaters because they wanted to qualify to be Best Picture. Lost out to Parasite, The Irishman.
But I mean, part of the equation, obviously, but still, it does relate to what we've been talking about with YouTube content. And breaking down the late night talk shows into those 5-minute bites. I don't know who makes money from that, because with at least television and advertising, you have to get advertisers to be the patrons of these different shows, and so you can sort of understand the business models of that. But I don't understand the business model of a YouTube, and if they just put this stuff up, for free, I understand there's other things going on here, but still, how do they generate revenue from that?
So if you're on YouTube and you have copyright safe material,
that is also generally family friendly. That's also important.
Generally family friendly. You can monetize, and even though you're not having ads being sold directly for your stuff, there's general ads that are bought by YouTube so that free users.
So the 5 seconds I have to wait.
Yes.
Okay.
The 5 seconds. So that there you go. You're the product in that capacity.
Yeah.
The 5 seconds that you wait, a 1/100th of a cent goes to of that ad that you're watching goes directly to Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah.
Well,
to his pocket.
to his pocket.
Yeah.
And that goes straight from his pocket to the liquor store. Fame drunk Jimmy Fallon.
Goodness. How are we doing on time, by the way?
You're about there.
We're about there. Okay.
Well, one more thing. Make a point about this. I don't know.
All right, Columbo.
What you guys think about this? But my wife and I recently watched the Tina Turner documentary.
Okay, yeah.
And again, that may be a different generation. I was not a huge Tina Turner fan, but many of her hits were so big that you had to hear them.
Yeah.
But another element in this, going to the gatekeeper's point, is how a manager or is really important for making someone a star. And I don't know that they necessarily know what they're doing, but it does click in some ways that they get the right agent or manager. We happened to watch that. I had been in Cape Town, South Africa this summer, and so that was an excuse for us to rewatch the movie Searching for Sugar Man. I don't know if you guys have seen this. It's
I've heard the title, but
Rodriguez, this Detroit-based singer who tried to get a career going. Some people thought he was going to be the next Dylan back in the late 60s and 70s. Then he has this whole huge following in South Africa, of all places, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and eventually they find him. He goes on a tour in South Africa, and, it's kind of a comeback story a little bit. But, he had talent, and it didn't go. She had talent, it did go, and it wasn't going well when she was with Ike Turner. But then she found this other guy, and then it goes boom.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's something that I don't think studios, the kind of official gatekeepers, can actually
manage or control.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because, we're talking about the democratization of stuff. And now, right, a lot of people, I think Taylor Swift is a great example of this, actually. They don't need that anymore because folks have an additional level of power. I know I know what you're gonna say.
Yeah, that's definitely. She wants you to think she doesn't need that. Okay, all right. She wants you to think that she does. She has those people.
Well, you know who doesn't need one? Mr. Beast, right?
Yes, he does though.
No.
Yeah, because once nowadays it might seem like the manager or the publicist don't have much power. In order for you to break through certain thresholds, you have to start paying people in order to basically run your entire public persona, because that's not something, because with social media and
But the
different
thing
platforms,
is that previously, and even to get to that point, you
Yeah,
needed to hire a person, or
Yeah.
you needed to have somebody represent you, right?
Yeah.
Now, you are in the position of power, and you say, "You
quick, what does
manage
Taylor
my
Swift's
stuff."
dad do?
What does
Taylor Swift's dad do?
He's a record producer, right?
No, he rents tour buses. Who does he rent tour buses to?
Britney Spears.
Yeah, I'm sure at some point, yes.
Yeah. She's taking her knife dance onto the road.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, it's not. It's what you do need those other people. Like, raw talent is not. Raw talent like get you somewhere. It's
Do you
not
think she doesn't need?
No, I think that okay, so we're talking about gatekeepers and all that stuff. I mean, she has wrestled power from the record label and basically re-recorded and has re-released her music under her own
with her own masters
organization, so that she doesn't have to pay royalties to that organization, and they no longer get a percentage, right? So she directly wrestled control from there. I will say, she is like a super duper star and has that kind of power, right? That flexibility, that political capital to be able to do that. Not just anybody can, but I can't even imagine that being the case, 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, well,
Could she do that without social media? Do you think?
well, no, because nobody would know where to find the music.
True. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where it's like, so
where is it being distributed?
Where is it being distributed nowadays? With streaming and social media, she can say, "Oh yeah, so I'm going to Spotify and I'm telling them put my version up on the Spotify. I still have control over my Spotify page."
Yeah.
And then that's that. You have that extra power. But I don't know. I was talking to somebody who I know was a recording artist, or is a recording artist, but was a big recording artist in the 90s, and he was telling me that basically every famous person is in constant litigation, constant musicians with their record labels, just over that exact thing. Now Taylor Swift just decided not to be in litigation anymore, right? But either selling your stuff, trying to get more money for your stuff, figuring out who has it, arguing during the transition, having your lawyers facilitate all this stuff. I mean, that's just basically, you just have to do that constantly just for upkeep, because otherwise, you're going to have the Michael Jackson Beatles backlog story, which you know the story, right?
Yeah.
Have you heard about this, about the Beatles backlog?
No.
Yeah, so this is a funny story. One day, Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson were having lunch at a somewhere on Sunset Boulevard. They're having lunch. Lunch is wrapping up, and Paul is talking about how much of a bear it is to re-up your rights, right? Because how it works is they become public purchasable. Some contracts allow the rights to be public purchasable for a brief period, and it's usually perfunctory, because then the artist is the first to know about this and they purchase their rights. But he's complaining about this to Michael Jackson.
Oh no.
And Michael Jackson literally just hops in his car, drives to the record label, and buys the entire Beatles back catalog. Do you not know about this?
No.
That's insanity.
Yeah, so he for years owned the Beatles back catalog and was getting all of the revenue from it.
Oh.
Yeah.
That is an incredibly
And-
shrewd business move from a man.
Do we know what Paul McCartney?
They never spoke again. And they were having lunch. They were friendly enough he was friendly enough to confide in him at that point. But he was like, "Look,
man.
you kind of have to respect him for it." He's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
"Look, the Beatles backlog."
Did he need the money?
I doubt it.
Does anybody need the money?
That kind of money?
Yeah.
Jeez
Yeah.
Louise.
So it's pretty wild. Which nowadays a lot of that stuff is happening because people are exploding without having copyright protection over their content or their stuff. So like they'll make music or videos or a podcast like this, which has no copyright protection whatsoever. But
I mean, we have such a strong brand.
Yeah,
I need to go.
Goes to the Flagstar Bank.
but because of that, there's a it's a lot of that stuff happens more than you think.
Did Richmond out of Richmond, did he make any money off of that?
I think so, but mostly streaming revenue.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Interesting.
what I've heard.
Anyway, we do have to wrap up. But before we go, want to thank our patrons so much for supporting the show, primarily Joe Papalardo, Zach and Amber Strehle, Sammy Roberts, Luke Robson, for your contributions. We could not do this without you. If you guys are interested in supporting the show, it's Patreon.com/Monomaniacs pod. I get that wrong every single time. You think I'd be better prepared for it. If you're interested, we do record a Patreon post show, and we have all of that backlog uploaded on our Patreon if you'd like to support. Thank you so much for coming on, sir. It's been a pleasure. It's been a good time.
It's been great, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a blast.
You'll have to have us on the Protestant podcast.
I will.
Dude, that'd be crazy. And if you're interested, guys, please like, comment, and subscribe. Very helpful.
Smash the like button.
You heard him, dude. You got stuff.